And finally, new rule, if you're part of today's woke revolution, you need to study the part of revolutions where they spin out of control because the revolutionaries get so drunk on their own purifying elixir, they imagine they can reinvent the very nature of human beings. Communists thought selfishness could be cast out of human nature. Russian revolutionaries.
Yeah, I think that, there's already a lot going on that should be broken down. First of all, he's treating like woke revolution as if it's something that's grassroots, when it's not. What we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years, a phenomenon we describe as wokeism or woke washing. I know there's people that, they might not like the term, but they agree with the concept and, criticize it in their own way. I know RBN calls it like the boutique left and the way that the boutique left approaches things. But, what we've seen is consistently an approach from both capitalism and imperialism that uses the symbols, the language, the hashtags, the discourse, the ways of presenting oneself from these at some point grassroots struggles of marginalized communities and oppressed groups, and uses these at the service of imperialism, at the service of capitalism. And it's very much embedded in playing on the sentimentality of the mass of people which have come to accept that racism is wrong, that sexism is wrong, that oppression of minorities is wrong, that have come to accept these, positive things that people should accept, but they play on those sentiments in order to manufacture consent at home for, a progressively presented capitalism that paints emancipation and liberation of oppressed and marginalized communities as the diversification of faces in high places, as if, the only problem that the U.S. has is that, it isn't the case that 13% of billionaires are black, or that, however, whatever percent of the population is LGBTQ, that's not represented in the amount of the top 1%. That's what it paints as liberation. And, that is itself something that you have to attack. Or take the case of, how they approach legitimizing their imperialist attacks on Venezuela, Cuba, China. Well, they always emphasize the minority component of the Uyghurs that are being, genocided, which again, it's all made up. But part of the narrative that strikes the liberal population is the fact that they're minority, a Muslim minority. In Cuba, when they wanted to row, the war drums against Cuba in 2021, July 2021, they talked about how Cuba was oppressing black artists and brown artists and brown singers. And it leaves out the fact very conveniently that these folks were taking money from the NED and from the State Department and from the CIA. And then when they would come to Florida, they would meet with Trump and with DeSantis and the more far-right elements of U.S. politics. In Venezuela, it emphasizes, anti-LGBTQ policies in Venezuela. It does it with Russia. It does it with any country that's outside of the sphere of influence of empire. It uses the sentimentality of the population in order to promote imperialism in a woke manner. And we call it wokeism because it's been playing a systematic role in the imperialist narrative over the last at least 5 years or so. So to sit here and talk about a woke revolution as if it's something that's grassroots and not, very much top down and used by capitalist imperialism to further its interests is completely wrong. Do you want to say something about that before we go into the second part of his comment about human nature, which it's infuriating.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I just wanted to say, China did kind of change human nature with their revolution. Or the nature of their people's lives, which then in turn, changes human nature, changes the cultural superstructure. And you can say what you want about the Cultural Revolution and the attempt to, change culture along with changing the mode of production. But there were cultural practices in China prior to the revolution, like foot binding, where women's feet would be bound up really tight to make this curved hook. And that was gotten rid of by the revolution. There was the Dalai Lama in Tibet, the dominant feudal landlord who would gouge out the eyes of his slaves if they disobeyed him or didn't meet the quotas or work hard enough. And there were, other versions of the Dalai Lama, other feudal landlords all over China, many of whom were famously killed after the revolution because of the brutality and the torture that they had put on the peasants for so many years. And now, if you watch our video about the construction of modern China, they've managed to industrialize and become a modern, very wealthy country who's actually accomplished the incredible task that no other country in the world has accomplished of abolishing relative poverty. So to act like that didn't change the nature of people's lives or change, quote unquote, human nature in China is absurd. Of course it did. The revolution changed people's lives for the better massively, which is why the U.S. has been throwing a tantrum about it pretty much ever since. But yeah, easy for Bill Maher to just dismiss the gains of the revolution, though, when he's had a pampered position within the U.S. ruling class, spewing his liberal and neoliberal talking points on television for the last 30 years or whatever. Oh, and thank you for the super chat, by the way, comrade.
Yes, comrade. Thank you. Yeah, the bourgeoisie loves talking about human nature, and it's a pure abstraction. What's the? It's to imagine that how a human being was in the feudal era is the same as how a human being was at the beginning of capitalism, and then the same as a human being today, and the same as a human being in 100 years when hopefully we have a global socialist world. It's just completely absurd, and there might be very small common elements, but it's the human being as a universal category, in order to exist, has to, as every other universal, concretize itself in the particular. This is, without understanding dialectics, people cannot understand this. This is the dialectic of the universal and the particular. The way that the bourgeoisie treats these concepts, which are universal, is as abstract universal, in a way that's divorced from history, in a way that's divorced from context, from time and place. The way that the Marxists and the Hegelians as well, the good Hegelians, treat universals is as concrete universals. Universals, if not incarnated in history in a specific time and place, do not exist. They are, as Hegel would say, empty universals. They're abstract universals. And so, the question of human nature is a question which requires a historical response. What's human nature under capitalism? Which means that the nature, the essence of the human being is defined socially. There might be these very basic abstract components that on their own are empty and meaningless, but those abstract components take form, they take shape within different historical circumstances. So the human being under capitalism, a cutthroat capitalism as the one that we have, is obviously going to have certain inclinations towards greed. That's all they grow up with. A human being under socialism, taught that the purpose of work is to help the community, is obviously going to have different inclinations, and we've seen that at play in Cuba. The vast majority of Cubans are still in Cuba. They work not for the gain that their personal work makes them, but because of the fact that it helps the revolution and it helps their brothers and sisters on the island, or the internationalist missions that are done by the doctors that are not for their own lucrative gain. They're done for the sake of humanity and to further the revolution. So to talk about human nature, that's an abstraction. Human nature is defined socially, and it's something that the ability to talk about human nature in general is something that develops with capitalism. Once you have a mode of production that expands throughout the whole world, then it can fancy itself with these sorts of abstractions about humans in general. But there's not a truth to it.
No, I mean, if you read Engels' Origins, you know that humans way back when had group marriage. So you and your sisters, or a woman and her sisters would be married to a group of brothers, not related, but And you would just like live that way and keep the household together. And so to act like that human nature can be universalized and act like human nature was the same thing throughout every epoch of history in every mode of production is absurd. You can look at the way humans have lived in any time period, and it's greatly different, and that greatly affects the psychology of people and how they live, how they keep their house. Every aspect of people's lives is different in different modes of production for the most part. So yeah.
And if you take the approach, which I don't think it's fully correct, but if you take the approach that you're going to look at the characteristics of humanity that have been present in in the most time in human history, cooperation would be one of those central characteristics. Evolutionary theorists have held that the only reason why human beings have even come into existence as a species is that we were monkeys, that we were the weakest ones on the trees, and we were kicked out by other monkeys onto the land. And once we got to the land, the only way we can survive having other predators that were stronger than us, faster than us, they had things like claws that we didn't have. The only way we could survive was through cooperation, through labor, through the development of communication, through the development of planning. So the social and collective element has been in human communities for far longer than any of the greedy elements that really begin to develop once you have the development of class society. Once society produces, because of how effective they have achieved production thanks to historical development, once they produce a surplus, a small class of people decide what to do with that surplus, and then that begins this sort of class fragmentation that just proliferates throughout history. And out of that class fragmentation, you have the development of emotional affects such as greed and these other different things. But those are, again, historically constituted. But important thing is to say, human beings are an abstraction that's concretized and takes different form in the different historical circumstances that they come to exist in.
Yes, I think we've said that about 700 different ways. So.
Spoke of the new Soviet man who wasn't motivated by self-interest, but instead wanted to be part of a collective. No, it turns out he wanted to be on a yacht in a Gucci tracksuit holding a vodka and a prostitute.
Sorry, I gotta stop it as we listen to the liberals cheering that. Woohoo! Yeah, why do 75% of Russians now want to return to the Soviet economic model? The American liberals, again, living in comfort in the West, have such a comical, propagandized idea of what the fall of the Soviet Union was. They think everybody in Russia, as soon as the Soviet Union fell, was on a yacht, in a tracksuit. Just this American entertainment media stereotype of what a Russian person is. It was a human rights disaster. They hadn't dealt with unemployment in years because everybody was employed by the state, and they had their housing supplied by the state, their utilities, and all of a sudden these things were ransacked by Western multinationals. And all of a sudden people were thrown onto the streets for the first time, and there were people dying of starvation for the first time, and prostitution and the drug trade flowed over the border for the first time since 1917. And which is largely why a lot of people want to return to an economic model similar to the Soviet Union, because it threw everyone into such degradation. And there was a common saying at the time, everything they told us about communism was a lie, but everything they told us about capitalism in the Soviet Union was true. Meaning maybe we didn't achieve this Soviet new man, maybe we didn't achieve the ideal of our society, which, socialism is a process of construction. It's not building a utopia overnight. So, we can understand why they didn't achieve this ideal society, especially being the first socialist experiment under tons of attack from imperialist aggression outside. But once the Soviet Union fell, even the people who were tricked by the bourgeoisie and who were tricked into dismantling their own socialist experiment in allowing capitalism and consumerism in, they said, oh, capitalism wasn't what we thought it was for the most part. Everything they told us about capitalism was true. It does put people in poverty. It does exploit people. It does leave people without security. So no, they didn't accomplish the creation of the new man, although there are, examples of quote unquote human nature changing with the construction of socialism, as Carlos was saying earlier. But to act like, the fall of the Soviet Union brought freedom and wealth to that part of the world is a Western myth that's laughable.
There's literally a term that political sciences have came up with, which is demodernization. The first time a country has demodernized and gone, in terms of the most vital statistics that define a state, gone at least 100 years in time. And that's the result of the fall or the overthrow or the crumbling, whatever you want to call it, of the Soviet Union. And, I love the way that these liberals approach things. It's so funny. They just take one fact, which is that, okay, there was a class of oligarchs that developed after the fall. And they say, here's my theory about human nature, and here it is proven. It's so absolutely stupid. And, it's, again, I'm sorry to be repetitive, but it's an absence of dialectical thinking. Like, none of these facts exist isolated. There's a plethora of other facts that developed conjoint with a million other facts into the fact that he's looking at. And he can't understand that fact that he's looking at if he doesn't look at it in the context of the factors that allowed it to be. And so, it's just absurd. And it's an absurdity that's so common in the US that you don't even have to defend anymore.
True.
Thank you, Carmen.
Yep. Thank you for the super chat, David. Really appreciate that. The OG Patreon.
Not standing in line all day for a potato. The problem with communism and with some very recent ideologies here at home is that they think you can change reality by screaming at it, that you can bend human nature by holding your breath. But that's the difference between reality and your mommy. Lincoln once said that you can repeal all past history, but you still cannot repeal human nature. But he's canceled now, so fuck him.
Lincoln also said labor is prior to and superior to capital and should be given much the higher consideration. But yet we have capitalist stooges like Bill Maher giving us the news. So,
and he was pen pals with Marx. Very excited with Marx's support. He was looking forward to, in some later writings, to taking into account the question of wage slavery after chattel slavery was abolished. But no, Lincoln was a liberal paradise, according to this guy.
Right.
Yesterday, I asked ChatGPT, are there any similarities between today's woke revolution and Chairman Mao's Cultural Revolution of the 1960s? And it wrote back, how long do you have? Because, again, in China, we saw how a revolutionary thought he could do a page-one rewrite of humans. Mao ordered his citizens to throw off the four olds. Old thinking, old culture, old customs, and old habits. So, your whole...
Again, in a lot of ways, they did. Like, what? Talk about foot binding, Bill Maher. Talk about the Dalai Lama slaves who had their eyes gouged out. Oh, wait, you don't know shit about that. You just have this typical American propagandized view of every existing socialist country. And you just repeat talking points as if that's analysis, which I guess is liberal analysis. But
the southern slave owners thought it was human nature to have the white man enslave the black slave. So with these arguments about human nature, you can pull anything out of your ass and defend it. It's just used as a card to defend whatever the existing state of affairs is.
Life went in the garbage overnight, no biggie. And those who resisted were attacked by an army of purifiers called the Red Guard, who went around the country putting dunce caps on people. Yeah, who didn't take to being a new kind of mortal being. A lot of pointing and shaming went on. Oh, and about 1 million dead. And the only way to survive was to plead insanity for the crime of being insufficiently radical, then apologize and thank the state for the chance to see what a piece of shit you are. And of course, submit to re-education, or as we call it here in America, freshman orientation.
I like
Story. There's a law professor.
I like how at least he didn't say, some of these more outrageous numbers, like 60 million. He kept it to a decent 1 million dead, which is so incredibly stupid. Like if you look at the statistics of China, even in its worst periods in the Great Leap Forward, the death rate wasn't any higher than the average death rate in these poor countries of the colonized South, where people were dying at a higher rate because they had been kept systematically poor by colonialism. It had nothing to do with the system. In fact, the system was what abolished that sort of condition. If you just compare China, and we're talking here about pre-78 China, before reform and opening up, and before the miracle that has been, for China. Even during the period of the pre-78 China, compare it with India. What do you find? The living standard, the raising of the living life expectancy in China was quicker than it's ever been before in human history. It went from, I believe, 32, 33 years to 67. India's only went to 55. And India's was, it was a pretty high rise. But, Mao's China went up to 67. It was the quickest life expectancy increase in the history of humanity. And that came conjoint with a bunch of other raisings of living standards. Now, they clearly weren't enough, and there was still a lot of inequality between China and the developed world that was, destroyed with time, or has been progressively destroyed with the policy of reform and opening up. But the successes of that pre-78 period, which the Chinese are very critical of still, have been tremendous. And to ignore that is just to participate in myth telling and not genuine historical research.
And it's got like what the party was doing at that time. And someone kind of said this in the chat, but it's nothing like what the woke movement is. One, it was carried out by the Communist Party, whereas the woke movement is more decentralized and kind of attached to the Democratic Party in a way. But the main thing that the party was trying to do at the time, and if you read anything from Mao, this will be glaringly obvious, is consolidate support of the people. Consolidate support of the people by serving the people. Serve the people, meet the people's needs, be there for the people, and then the people will support the party and support the society that we're trying to build, which is just a society for itself, for its own benefit. Versus, the woke movement is all about dividing the people. It's all about placing people into more and more different groups, and talking about how there can be no unifying class struggle. The working class needs to be divided up into more and more groups, and there can be no true unity between these groups because their subjective experiences are just too different. It's the exact opposite ideology that Mao and the Communist Party were based on.
That's an excellent point, and we're going to see that point really nicely hammered out with the next video from Christian Parenti. But yeah, it's just so radically different. And again, if you view what he calls the woke revolution from the angle that we do as something that has become, maybe it wasn't at one point, but it has become something that's very top down, something that's very much used at the service of capitalist imperialism, to even think about comparing that with the Cultural Revolution is just completely absurd.
Absolutely.
Professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago, named Jason Kilbourne, whose crime was that on one of his exams, he used a hypothetical case where a black female worker sued her employer for race and gender discrimination, alleging that managers had called her two slur words, the type of real-world case these students might one day confront. And knowing the extreme sensitivity of today's students, he didn't write the two taboo words on the test, just the first letter of each. He was teaching his students how to fight racism in the place where it matters most, the criminal justice system. But because he merely alluded to those words, again, in the service of a good cause, he was banned from campus, placed on indefinite leave, and made to wear the dunce cap. No, not really the dunce cap part, but our American version of that. 8 weeks of sensitivity training, weekly 90-minute sessions with a diversity trainer, and having to write 5 self-reflection papers. A grown-ass man, a liberal law professor. If you can't see the similarities between that and this, the person who needs re-education is you.
It is interesting how Americans have, you know, there are things like corporate punishments or employer punishments that get passed down all the time, but Americans don't see that as authoritarian or dictatorial. It's only the things that, you know, our government has alleged against the Chinese government that are authoritarian, when we have the most authoritarian system of all. Your boss is a dictator who owns your labor for the majority of your week, you know, and you spend all your time working under them, and they're allowed to punish you and make you write papers and do whatever they did to this guy. And again, this is an example of wokeism breaking up a struggle for legal justice. You know, someone who is trying to unify and teach people how to struggle against racial injustice in the legal system. And this sort of cancel culture, woke ideology, whatever you want to call it, was used to break up that collective struggle. So again, we see how it's not the same as communist ideology or the theory of class struggle.
And you know, I'm always I always marvel at the fact that these folks are able to take things that most people disagree with about capitalism, and then in order to critique it, they call it communism. And you know, whether that's the libertarians with the state, right? Anything that the state does that is evil, we hate it. They fail to see that it's a capitalist state. They just call it socialism. Or whether it's with this, you know, one of the main ways that in the workplace this woke ideology manifests itself is in, you know, human HR departments and diversity, equity, and inclusion departments cracking down on working people for, you know, very small things, and just constantly surveilling working people. So, you know, this has, you know, been a development that capitalism has used to its advantage in order to crack down on workers even more. It's a phenomenon which has developed out of capitalism, and if you dislike some of its effects, don't go comparing it to communism. You know, look at its real sources. Its sources have been capitalism. The ends which it serves, in this form at least, are capitalism.